they can at least sell it to themselves and to the boss as, hey, we've got this guy for a couple of years, and if worse comes to worse, we can trade him next year or vice versa, whatever, so on and so forth. But either way, I'm with you. I think the most likely thing is nothing. I really do. I think that what people are asking is not that the tribe doesn't try. I just think these prices are exorbitant of what teams are trying to get for marginal guy. When I heard Bruce and I were talking off air the other day about some of the, like AJ Burnett and some of the things these teams are looking to get, and I'm like, I wouldn't give you anything for A.J. Burnett at this stage in his career to come over to the American League. In my opinion, he's got a 5 ERA now, and he's over there. And the last time he was here, he was almost a 6 when he was at Seattle or wherever he was at. I just don't see any. I think they owe him like $8 million for the next 8 starts that he's got left this season, and like, no way would I trade more than a bag of balls for a guy like that. Philly has him on a 1-year deal. Why would they? And they're trying to juice prospects out of teams for A.J. Burnett. Like, unbelievable that a team would give up anything of significant value for a guy. And I like Burnett, and I know he brings you some grit and some playoff, kind of mentality, I guess, but that doesn't help you on the mound if you can't get it done, And I'm not saying he can't, but I don't think he's a difference maker. I wouldn't give up anything for him. Those are the kind of guys that are getting pawned off right now.
Yeah, and that goes back to, why I think we both agree that the Indians will likely stand pat, or if they make a move, it'll be a very minor move. I think because they're probably their biggest need is starting pitching, and that comes at the highest price. I mean, you just gave a great example of why, the Indians likely won't make a deal because he's very mediocre. And I'll go back to that Deadspin story that we talked about a couple weeks ago. I mean, all of those emails in the first half of that story is all what the Astros asked for and wanted for Bud Norris. I mean, Bud Norris has a losing record in his career. I mean, we're not talking about guys that move the needle.
Right.
So giving up, what is still a thin farm system, the Indians are in a better place than they were 3 or 4 years ago in their farm system, but they are not deep with talent. And once you get by Lindor, with the exception of maybe Clint Frazier, and he's a far ways away at this point. With the exception of those two, there are guys in this organization who can be major league contributors, but I don't think there's anyone in this organization that I would consider, future star potential once you get past those two. And so, that makes it because they don't have that depth there if they wanted to make it, not to mention teams are asking for, the moon and the stars.
Yeah, and we talk about that depth too. So a lot of it is being seen, as we mentioned, to kind of come circle around to the beginning of this conversation, at the major league level already. Really, the future is some of it's here, and the next few years, you got a few of the guys that you've named, and they're continuing to fill in below that. But I'm with you too. The not moving the needle, best way to put it. A lot of these guys, at the end of the day, with what's left in the season, how much do they even move the needle? And that's what the key. And that's where I think going back to our first part of this with Lindor, that, maybe you get more jump and more of a spark down the stretch bringing a guy like that up. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's very possible. And I think that's probably where the Indians and I differ because if it was me, if Chris Antonetti calls me up after I get off the phone with you and asks for my advice would be to trade Asdrubal Cabrera for whatever you could get. And if that's something that doesn't help this team in the next 2 months, I would still, likely make that trade, with an eye towards the future. But they have players that can play shortstop in Mike Aviles and Jose Ramirez. And if you want that spark, you can bring up Francisco Lindor in a couple weeks if you want to, and go with him from there.
How can they trade Asdrubal, though? By the way, I haven't heard today if there's an update of the latest, but If he goes on the DL, then you can just pretty much wipe that off because that'll overextend past the trade deadline. But, I mean, do you see them moving him, especially now this injury coming up when it did, just has to be, hey, man, and I'm just joking, but part of me, my conspiracy theory side, as soon as that happened, I said, man, he's phony, man. He just doesn't want to get traded. He's like, you know what? I'm not moving for 2 months, man. I'm comfortable here in Cleveland, and I'm not going anywhere, man. My back locked up. I'll be better in 10 days, right after the trade deadline.
Drupal Cabrera has been very comfortable in Cleveland for a while, and that might be some of the problem as to why some people are looking forward to the end of his Cleveland tenure. Comfortable would be a polite way to describe as Drupal Cabrera at times. But, you know, I mean, in all seriousness, Jerry, I think it is inconvenient for sure that this injury has happened when it did. But I will also play devil's advocate and say I think as Drupal Cabrera, if he comes back, whether he goes on the DL or not, and I'll tell you, they're going to wait as long as they can to not put him on the DL because they don't want that picture to other teams. They want this, whether it is or not, to appear as if it's a day-to-day injury and that he can be back real quick, so that they have that option at least to deal him if that's what they choose to do. But regardless, I mean, if you want to play your worst-case scenario, that he goes on the DL, and of course then that goes through the trade deadline. I think it is very, very likely that as Drupal Cabrera is a guy that would get through waivers, and I know that sounds crazy, but I think that he would, or I think he would get through enough waivers that the team that claimed him, you know, would have legit interest in him, and you could work out a deal if that were to happen. And they slide guys through waivers all the time. I mean, you know, if he's hurt, you know, on August 1st, I mean, that might be the time that the Indians put him on waivers, because if you're a team and you claim him, I mean, we've seen it more and more in recent years, where teams will say, okay, you claimed him, you know, absorb his contract, and we'll put him on the next flight. He's yours. Another team doesn't hold in just how hurt he is. You know, you don't want the egg on your face of claiming a guy who really is going to be out until September or something. So,
exactly.
You know, I can really see him sliding through waivers and the Indians finding themselves in August still with the ability to trade him if that's the route they choose. And I actually think the longer the season goes, maybe in August is a better chance they trade him as this season plays out. I mean, because somebody in the American League is going to go on a run. I mean, if it's not the Indians, I mean, being 51-50, if they keep playing 500, I mean, the week is going to come where you and I are going to talk and we're going to say, you know, fill in the blank team, you know, now that they've won 7 out of their last 10, you know, it's officially getting dark for the Cleveland Indians if they continue to just hang around 500. And so, you know, if that plays out in August, I mean, you know, probably then we're having serious conversation about, is it time to, you know, punt on Asdrubal Cabrera.
Well, that's why I think for the next 7 days, it's kind of like at the race. You're coming out of the warning lap, and all of the teams are kind of jockeying, getting their spot in the lane, making their final moves and their trades here, and then, boom, the yellow flag goes on August 1st, and I agree with you. You'll reach a point. It's either going to be the Indians or it's going to be somebody else who makes that run, and you're going, hey, they pulled away from the pack. And it's great, and that's why I'm telling you, man, I still believe, I'm sticking to it. Not only do I believe that the Indians can win the wild card, I still think that they can track down this division for the simple fact that they play well with Detroit, at least so far. They've still got 7 games left against Detroit in the month of September. And, I mean, as much as you don't want to talk about last year, their month of September, with the exception of those Detroit games, sets up a lot like September last year. You've got a lot of teams that are going to be in meaningless or marginal positions, and there's some of the lower teams. I remember Houston, there's some White Sox in there, there's some Minnesota, there's some other teams that, you know, you have the ability to make a run through the month of September if you're the Indians just looking at the team's schedule. So all of that tells me, man, they are every bit in this thing. And so, I mean, I'm still there. I think they can win the division, but I mean, they can't do it the way you can't play 500. You're not going to do it with 83 wins. They're going to have to make, like we said, that run, and whichever team does it is coming out of the gates. And I think the next 7 days is these cars, the teams jockeying, getting ready to boom, drop the flag and go.
Yeah, and I think this weekend, is a huge series with the Royals, and I mean, they definitely, in my mind, they let one get away from them yesterday. There's no excuse they should have won, and that game is going to haunt them. But I mean, I look at this weekend, as you say, jockeying for position in the next week. I don't. This is one of those series in my mind. I don't know that you can win anything out of it, but you can lose a lot. I think for the Royals and the Indians, if one team were to take 3 or 4 or a sweep, I think for the team on the short end of that stick, whether it were Kansas City or Cleveland, the slide in both races, the wild card and the division, if they were to lose, if they were to get swept or even lose 3 or 4, I think that changes things for sure as you go the next week.
Absolutely. I mean, that would put huge separation between those two. And then the whole thing, what was the second wild card? I think you've got, 7 or 8 teams with the 3.5, 4 games, something like that. And the whole AL East is there. The Indians, the Royals, they're all within a couple of games. I think within 3.5. I don't have the standings right in front of me, but they're all right there within 3.5 or 4 of Seattle.
Right, and that's the thing. The Indians are 2 back, but they also have 2 teams in front of them still. So, you're not just chasing the lead; you're chasing a lot of teams, and that's where I say, I think this, in some ways, has the potential to kind of be one of those elimination series between the Indians and the Royals. Because if somebody wins the series, the loser of that series is going to find themselves probably getting passed this weekend by a couple teams, and suddenly the road to the postseason is going to look a lot tougher.
Absolutely. Some separation needed. Only a half a game right now separates the Indians and Kansas City. Crucial 4-game series for the teams. The Indians started off with their ace on the mound, Corey Kluber, tonight, 8:10 p.m., takes on Danny Duffy. You've got Tomlin, Zach McAllister on Saturday, taking on former Indian Jeremy Guthrie, and then a pretty good matchup on Sunday, Danny Salazar and Bruce Chen. And so what do you think, this series? How do you see it playing out, Indians and the Royals?
I think you have Corey Kluber and a whole lot of mediocrity behind it. And, it all depends on what you get out of those guys. I mean, maybe it's a conversation for the off season, but at this point, I think other than Corey Kluber and Trevor Bauer is becoming that second guy. Everyone in this rotation is a 4th or 5th starter, and you don't know what you're going to get. They're Forrest Gump's, box of chocolates. You just don't know, what's going to come out from day to day. And, if you get the good side, things go well. And if you don't, you run the risk of being on the short end of that series. But certainly for that reason, I think that it is so important, and unfortunately, he starts to shoulder more and more of it. But I think it's very important to get the first one with Kluber on the mound, because you gotta get the first one to hopefully win that series. And if you don't get that first one with Kluber, I think there's reason to get nervous right away.
No, I agree with you 100%. Kluber goes out there and sets the pace, sets the tone tonight. I'm calling it. We'll talk about it tomorrow. Bruce in the chat room. Kluber and the Columbus staff. That's about it. The Columbus crew. That's the soccer team, but you can also call it the remainder of the Indians rotation at this point. And the young guns, hey, they all get their chance this weekend uninterrupted. Everybody gets a turn to go through and see if they can continue to build. Bauer will be at the end of that coming up next week. But my man Mike, big series, as you said, Indians, Kansas City, one team with either team with a chance to make some distance, or maybe they split this thing and we're right back here on Monday. But either way, going to be a good series this weekend. It starts with Kluber. Can't wait to catch up with you next week. The Indians will be back home. We'll be right on the cusp of the trade deadline, and we'll kind of maybe have a better idea for what may or may not be going down.
Sounds good, my man.
And thanks for great conversation, good stuff on Lindor, great insight and all of that. And guys, don't forget, didthetryWinLastNight.com is where you can see it all every day. Mike, thank you so much.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
All right, my man, Mike Brandenburg.